Composite Squadron 9 rolled his Grumman TBF Avenger sharply to starboard, his eyes fixed on the shadowed silhouette cutting through the steel-gray waves below. The German submarine U-569 had just begun its emergency dive, seawater spraying as compressed air howled through its ballast vents. Drain had barely 90 seconds before the U-boat disappeared beneath the surface. The Avenger dropped from 600 feet to 300, Drain calculating the exact release point. Too soon, and the depth charges would miss. Too late, and his aircraft would be caught in the blast. His radio operator called out ranges, while the turret gunner kept his weapon trained on the submarine's deck crew, frantically trying to man their gun. 2 depth charges tumbled from the Avenger's bomb bay, striking the water 15 feet behind the U-boat's conning tower. 4 seconds later, twin plumes of white spray shot skyward as 450 pounds of Torpex detonated at 100 feet. The submarine convulsed, its stern lifting briefly from the sea as the shockwave tore through internal bulkheads. Oil began spreading across the surface in a widening slick. Drain circled above, watching German sailors clamber from the conning tower hatch. The submarine was doomed, its pressure hull breached, unable to dive again. The commander gave the only order possible: abandon ship. Minutes later, 47. German submariners floated in their life vests, watching their vessels slide stern first into 3,000 feet of Atlantic water. The Canadian destroyer HMCS St. Laurent moved in to recover survivors. 25 men rescued, 21 dead or lost with the boat. The sinking marked a turning point few in the U.S. Navy had foreseen. The aircraft that delivered the fatal strike had flown from USS Bogue, an escort carrier once dismissed by admirals as impractical. Too slow, too fragile, too small for modern naval warfare. Yet, this ungainly ship, converted from a merchant hull in less than 8 months, had just proven a capability that would reshape the Battle of the Atlantic. In the preceding months, German U-boats had enjoyed unprecedented success. During the first 20 days of March 1943, Admiral Karl Donitz's submarines had sunk 82 merchant ships totaling 476,000 tons. The convoy battles around HX-229 and SC-122 had destroyed 22 ships in only 4 days. British naval reports concluded that Germany had never come closer to cutting the Atlantic lifeline between North America and Britain. By May 1943, the U-boat fleet had reached its apex of power. 116 submarines prowled the shipping lanes, organized into wolf packs of unprecedented size. The statistics foretold catastrophe. U-boats were sinking Allied tonnage faster than shipyards could replace it. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, the vast stretch of ocean beyond land-based air cover, had become a slaughter zone. Convoys sailing through it did so without air protection for 700 miles. U-boat commanders called it the Black Pit, a place where they could surface, recharge batteries, and strike convoys almost at will. Into this crisis sailed a weapon the Navy's own leadership had resisted building. The Escort carrier program, begun in December 1940, faced staunch opposition from top naval officials. Admiral Harold Stark and Navy Secretary Frank Knox had both rejected the idea, insisting that converted merchant ships would be obsolete before completion. Knox had written that such vessels could no longer make satisfactory aircraft carriers. Small carriers, they warned, would be death traps, too slow to evade, too lightly armed to defend themselves, too limited in aircraft to be useful. Their arguments followed traditional carrier doctrine. Speed and striking power defined survival. Fleet carriers could launch devastating air raids and retreat at 30 knots before enemy surface forces could respond. They carried enough fighters for self-defense and armor thick enough to absorb bomb hits. Escort carriers possessed none of these traits. They crawled at 16 knots, carried only 24 aircraft, and had no armor. Any enemy cruiser could overtake and destroy them. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt overruled his admirals. On December 21, 1940, he sent a directive ordering the rapid conversion of merchant hulls into small carriers for anti-submarine warfare. Roosevelt understood what many officers did not. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought between carrier task forces, but between submarines and merchant men. The threat came from beneath the waves, not from enemy fleets. What was needed was endurance, not speed, coverage, not concentration. A small carrier cruising at 16 knots could patrol for weeks, while a fleet carrier burned through its fuel in days. The arithmetic favored slow, inexpensive escort carriers over massive, costly fleet ships. The first of these was USS Long Island, commissioned June 2, 1941. Built on a cargo ship hull, she displaced 7,800 tons, stretched 495 feet, and barely reached 16 knots. Her flight deck was a wooden platform bolted to a merchant frame, her armor non-existent, her capacity 21 planes. Pilots mocked her as a joke. The press dubbed them baby flattops, and sailors reinterpreted the CVE designation as combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Everything about these ships defied Navy tradition. Fleet carriers like Enterprise displaced nearly 20,000 tons, made 32 knots, and carried 90 aircraft, giants of the Pacific. Escort carriers, in contrast, were improvised workhorses. Yet the war in the Atlantic wasn't lost to fleets. It was lost in the empty mid-ocean gap, where convoys had no air support. Land-based bombers from Newfoundland could protect the western approaches, and British planes from Northern Ireland covered the eastern ones, but between them lay 700 miles of open, deadly sea. The U-boats ruled it. The first escort carriers to challenge them were British. HMS Audacity, converted from a captured German freighter, entered service in September 1941. Her aircraft drove off Focke-Wulf Condor bombers and disrupted U-boat attacks. In December, her fighters downed 2 Condors and forced 3 submarines to withdraw before U-751 torpedoed and sank her. Britain had proven the idea worked, but also exposed its dangers. In America, the Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Company began constructing C-3T-type cargo ships for the merchant marine. When the Navy requisitioned 20 hulls for carrier conversion, engineers redesigned them mid-build. Cargo holds were gutted, hangars installed, and elevators added to a 442-foot flight deck. A single hydraulic catapult aided takeoffs, and a small island structure housed the bridge and flight control. The ships rolled heavily in rough seas, their armament purely defensive. 2 5-inch guns, 8 twin 40mm Bofors, and 27 20mm Oerlikons. Their only real protection was their modest 18-knot speed. The lead ship, USS Bogue, commissioned September 26, 1942, under Captain Giles Short. She displaced 8 390 tons standard, nearly 14,000 fully loaded, and carried a crew of 890, including Composite Squadron 9, flying Grumman F-4F Wildcats, and TBF Avengers. After shakedown issues forced months of repair, Bogue finally sailed for the Atlantic in February 1943, just as U-boat attacks reached their height. Her mission: close the mid-Atlantic gap. For her first 3 crossings, she followed doctrine, patrolling ahead of convoys, searching for surfaced submarines. When U-boats sighted aircraft, they simply dove, waited for convoys to pass, and attacked from behind. 3 crossings, no kills. Critics declared the program a failure. Too slow, too small, too fragile. The Bureau of Aeronautics even proposed terminating the entire escort carrier project. Then, Admiral Ernest King changed the doctrine. As Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, King had been watching the British develop hunter-killer tactics. Instead of tying escort carriers to convoy defense, the British were experimenting with independent groups that hunted U-boat in areas where intelligence indicated submarine activity. In May 1943, King ordered American escort carriers to form hunter-killer groups that would operate independently from convoys. Bogue became the nucleus of the first American hunter-killer group. Accompanied by 4 destroyers, she departed Norfolk on April 22, 1943, with orders to seek out and destroy German submarines in the Central Atlantic. Her commander, Captain Short, had complete freedom to pursue any U-boat contact. Intelligence from HFDF, high-frequency direction-finding equipment, and from decoded Enigma messages would guide the group to areas of submarine concentration. The transformation from defensive convoy escort to offensive hunter began immediately. On May 21st, while escorting Convoy 184, Bogu's HFDF operators detected radio transmissions from multiple U-boat. Wolfpack Mosul, consisting of 21 submarines, was gathering to attack the convoy. Lieutenant Commander Draw launched 5 Avengers to hunt the transmitting submarines. The aircraft caught U-231 on the surface, recharging batteries. Depth charges damaged the submarine's radio transmitters, forcing her to abort patrol and return to France. The next day brought the breakthrough that validated the entire escort carrier concept. Multiple Bogue aircraft executed 5 separate attacks on different submarines throughout the day. U-305 suffered moderate damage. U-569 took catastrophic hits that forced her crew to scuttle. This marked the first U-boat sunk by United States Navy escort carrier aircraft. May 22, 1943. 30° north latitude, 42° west longitude, mid-Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander William Drain, commanding officer of more importantly, it demonstrated that hunter-killer groups could disrupt Wolfpack operations before they reached convoys. After delivering Convoy 184 safely to Argentia on May 26, Bogue received new orders. No more convoy escort. Pure hunter-killer operations. Intelligence would direct her group to submarine concentration areas. Her aircraft would saturate those areas with search patterns. Any U-boat found would be attacked with depth charges, later with homing torpedoes. The hunter-killer offensive had begun. On June 5, 1943, Bogue's aircraft found U-217 refueling from a submarine tanker in mid-Atlantic. The Avengers caught both submarines on the surface. Their depth charges sent U-217 to the bottom with all hands. A week later, on June 12th, aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 located U-18 attempting to charge batteries. The submarine crash dived, but too slowly. Depth charges ruptured her pressure hull at 150 ft depth. She sank with 49 crew members. July 23rd brought 2 kills in a single day. Bogue's aircraft spotted U-527 on the surface for her daily battery charge. Rockets and depth charges left her crippled and sinking. 12 survivors were rescued by destroyer Clemson and transferred to Bogue as prisoners. On the same patrol, destroyer George E. Badger, part of Bogue's screen, gained sonar contact on U-6113. Depth charges destroyed the submarine before she could launch the mines she was carrying to American coastal waters. The pattern continued through the summer and fall of 1943. Bogue's 8th patrol from November to December became her most successful. On December 13th, U-172 was located through HFDF intercepts. Aircraft from Bogue coordinated with 4 destroyers in a 27-hour running battle. The submarine twisted and turned, dove, and surfaced, but could not escape. She finally went down with 13 crew killed and 46 captured. December 20th completed the patrol with the sinking of U-850. In 6 weeks, this single escort carrier group had eliminated 3 German submarines. By the end of 1943, Bogue and her escorts had sunk 11 German U-boat plus 2 Japanese submarines. No convoy lost a ship while under Bogue's protection. Not a single aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 was shot down by enemy action during the entire war. Her task group received a Presidential Unit Citation for 6 of her 8 patrols, making her the most successful anti-submarine warfare carrier of World War II. The success was not limited to one ship. USS Card, sister ship to Bogue, began hunter-killer operations in August 1943. Her aircraft and escorts would sink 11 U-boat during the war. USS Core accounted for 7 kills. USS Block Island destroyed 7 before being torpedoed and sunk by U-549 on May 29, 1944. She was the only American escort carrier lost to submarine attack in the Atlantic. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic could be measured in brutal statistics. In March 1943, U-boat had sunk 82 ships totaling 476,000 tons in the Atlantic alone. In April, losses remained heavy with 39 ships and 235,000 tons. Then came May, the month that would be remembered as Black May by German submariners. 41 U-boats were sunk in May 1943. The carnage was unprecedented in submarine warfare. 18 went down in convoy battles, overwhelmed by improved escort tactics and new weapons. 14 fell to air patrols equipped with centimetric radar that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness or fog. The remainder were lost to mines, accidents, and hunter-killer groups like Bogue's task force. Among those destroyed were 5 crucial U-tankers, the submarine supply vessels that allowed German U-boat to operate far from their bases. These Type 14 U-boat, nicknamed milk cows by their crews, carried 700 tons of fuel oil, 4 torpedoes, and provisions for extended patrols. Each tanker could refuel a dozen attack submarines, extending their operational range by thousands of miles. Without these tankers, operational range collapsed. Submarines could no longer reach the distant hunting grounds in the Central Atlantic and Caribbean, where convoys were vulnerable. They were forced to operate closer to European waters where Allied defenses were strongest. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Submarines that had routinely achieved multiple kills per patrol were now struggling to survive. Boats that surfaced to recharge batteries at night found themselves illuminated by radar-equipped aircraft within minutes. Wolf packs that gathered to overwhelm. Convoy escorts discovered that escort carriers could vector destroyers onto them before they could coordinate attacks. The hunters were becoming the hunted. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donuts sent an encrypted message to all U-boat. The losses are too heavy. All boats are to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Return to base areas. The wolf packs had been defeated. After 3 years and 8 months of nearly continuous success, the German submarine offensive had been broken in 3 weeks. The U-boat withdrawal marked the turning point in the Atlantic battle, but not its end. Donuts refused to accept defeat. He committed German engineering and industrial resources to developing new submarine types that could operate submerged for extended periods. The Type 21 U-boat, with improved batteries and streamlined hull, could make 17 knots underwater, faster than most Allied escort ships. If deployed in sufficient numbers, these revolutionary submarines might regain the advantage. Meanwhile, escort carrier construction accelerated. Henry Kaiser's shipyards at Vancouver, Washington, began producing Casablanca-class carriers at an extraordinary rate. Kaiser, an industrialist with no shipbuilding experience before the war, had revolutionized ship construction by applying mass production techniques from automobile manufacturing and construction engineering. These purpose-built escort carriers, constructed from the keel up rather than converted from merchant hulls, incorporated lessons learned from earlier classes. Kaiser's yards used prefabricated sections built in enormous assembly buildings. Workers welded together hull sections, deckhouse modules, and machinery spaces inland, then transported the completed assemblies to the building ways. This modular construction dramatically reduced build times. The first Casablanca-class carriers required 8 months from KE laying to commissioning. By the middle of the production run, Kaiser's workers had reduced this to 3 and 1 to 2 months. Welding crews worked 3 shifts around the clock. Women, many with no prior industrial experience, operated welding equipment alongside experienced shipwrights. The yards employed orchestrated construction sequences, where multiple teams worked simultaneously on different sections of each ship. 50 Casablanca-class ships were ordered on June 18, 1942. The first USS Casablanca herself was commissioned on July 8, 1943. The 50th ship, USS Munda, was completed exactly 1 year later on July 8, 1944. This represented an average commissioning rate of 1 carrier every 7.3 days. At peak efficiency, Kaiser's yards were launching completed escort carriers faster than some shipyards could build destroyers. The ships emerged with improved stability, better aviation facilities, and more reliable machinery than the converted merchantmen. Each carrier displaced 7,800 tons, made 19 knots, and operated 28 aircraft. While still slow and vulnerable by fleet carrier standards, they proved perfectly adequate for anti-submarine work. The hunter-killer offensive continued with increased intensity through 1944. The tactics that made escort carrier groups so deadly evolved through combat experience. Aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 and other carrier air groups perfected the coordination between visual search, radar detection, and attack procedures. The Grumman TBF Avenger proved ideal for anti-submarine warfare. The aircraft could carry depth charges, acoustic homing torpedoes, or rockets depending on the tactical situation. Its long range allowed extended patrols far from the carrier. Its robust construction let it operate in weather that grounded lighter aircraft. The Avenger's 3-man crew provided redundancy with pilot, radioman, and turret gunner, each trained to take over if one was incapacitated. Depth charges remained the primary weapon through 1943. Mark 44 acoustic homing torpedoes, introduced in early 1944, revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. These weapons, nicknamed foe by their operators, could home on the sound of a submarine's propellers. Once dropped near a diving U-boat, the torpedo would circle until it detected engine noise, then track the submarine automatically. U-boat commanders discovered that their previous tactic of crash diving no longer guaranteed escape. The noise of their diving procedures attracted the very weapons they were trying to evade. Escort carrier groups developed elaborate search patterns that covered vast ocean areas. Aircraft flew sector searches, each plane assigned a specific area to patrol. When one aircraft detected a submarine, the carrier vetoed additional aircraft to the contact, while destroyers raced to the location. The submarine found itself facing attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Surface ships forced the boat to stay submerged while aircraft waited overhead for any attempt to surface. This coordinated pressure could continue for hours or days until the submarine's batteries died or its crew surrendered. In October 1944, Admiral Francis Lowe, Chief of Staff of the 10th Fleet, wrote in a memo to Admiral King that escort carrier support groups accounted for approximately 60% of all U-boat sunk by United States forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean during the 6 months from April through September. This extraordinary success ratio demonstrated how completely these converted merchantmen had transformed naval aviation doctrine. The hunter-killer groups had become more effective than land-based patrol aircraft, despite operating from ships that Navy leadership had initially rejected. Beyond their combat success, escort carriers proved their worth in ways the CT early skeptics had never imagined. They served as aircraft FIs, carrying planes from American factories to combat zones. USS Bogue made several trips to Glasgow, Scotland, transporting Army Air Force fighters. These missions freed fleet carriers for combat operations in the Pacific. Escort carriers provided air cover for amphibious landings. Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, employed 4 escort carriers among its support forces. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in August 1944, used 2 escort carriers to provide close-air support. The slow, converted merchantmen could loiter near invasion beaches, their aircraft on call for immediate support missions that faster fleet carriers could not provide. They served as training platforms for replacement pilots transitioning to carrier operations. USS Charger spent the entire war operating off the East Coast, qualifying thousands of naval aviators in carriering landings before they deployed to combat zones. This training role prevented fleet carriers from being diverted from combat operations for pilot qualification. Most critically, escort carriers vindicated President Roosevelt's strategic vision. The president had grasped that winning the Atlantic battle required closing the air gap. Land-based aircraft could not reach mid-ocean. Fleet carriers were too valuable and too few to tie down on convoy escort. Escort carriers offered the only solution: cheap enough to build in quantity, capable enough to operate aircraft effectively, available in sufficient numbers to provide continuous coverage. The numbers told the story of American industrial response to crisis. Of the 151 aircraft carriers built by the United States during World War II, 122 were escort carriers, approximately 80 were commissioned in the United States Navy during wartime. Another 38 were delivered to Britain under Lend-Lease. Production peaked in 1944 when American yards completed 47 escort carriers. This avalanche of hulls overwhelmed the U-boat threat through sheer numbers. By the end of 1944, only 6 American escort carriers remained assigned to Atlantic anti-submarine operations. The others had been sent to the Pacific, where they would prove equally valuable in a completely different role. The Atlantic had been won. The hunters had become prey. The cost had been significant. 6 American escort carriers were lost to enemy action during the war. USS Liscum Bay was torpedoed by Japanese submarine 1175 off the Gilbert Islands on November 24, 1943. The torpedo detonated the ship's bomb magazine. She sank in 23 minutes with the loss of 644 men. USS Block Island went down to U-549 in the Atlantic. 4 more escort carriers would be sunk in the Pacific theater, but measured against their impact, the cost was acceptable. By war's end, 11 American Atlantic escort carrier task groups had sunk 53 German submarines. This included the most remarkable achievement in anti-submarine warfare during World War II, the capture of U-505 intact on June 4, 1944. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding officer of escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, had been planning this operation for months. His task group had practiced boarding procedures repeatedly. When destroyers detected U-505 submerged approximately 150 meters off Spanish Sahara, Gallery ordered a relentless depth charge attack. The submarine, unable to escape and running out of battery power, surfaced after 8 hours of pursuit. As U-505 broke surface, her crew began abandoning ship. They assumed the Americans would sink their boat with gunfire, standard procedure in submarine warfare. But Gallery had ordered his ships to hold fire. As the German crew swam away from their submarine, a boarding party led by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David transferred from destroyer USS Pillsbury, a whaleboat. David and 8 men climbed aboard the abandoned submarine, expecting demolition charges to detonate at any moment. They found the boat intact. Scuttling charges had been set, but had not yet fired. The boarding party disabled the charges, closed valves to stop flooding, and secured the submarine. It was the first enemy vessel captured at sea by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. U-5005 yielded intelligence treasures. Her Enigma machine and code books provided cryptographers with insights into German naval communications. Her acoustic torpedoes gave Allied scientists examples of weapons they had only encountered in combat. Her charts revealed U-boat patrol routes and operational procedures. The capture remained classified throughout the war to prevent Germans from changing their codes and procedures. U-505 is now permanently displayed at Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry as a National Historic Landmark. Total U-boat losses to escort carrier groups represented a fraction of the 785 German submarines lost during the war. But the impact far exceeded the raw numbers. Escort carrier groups forced U-boat to remain submerged for extended periods, limiting their effectiveness. They prevented submarine concentration in wolf packs. They protected the convoys that carried 15 million tons of supplies to Britain during the critical period from May 1943 through June 1944. Perhaps most significantly, escort carriers destroyed the mythology that had surrounded submarine warfare since World War I. The idea that submarines were virtually undetectable, that they could strike with impunity from beneath the waves, that no defense existed against underwater attack, had dominated naval thinking for decades. Escort carriers proved that continuous air coverage could locate, track, and destroy submarines. They demonstrated that merchant hulls and commercial construction techniques could produce combat-effective warships in months rather than years. The transformation of naval doctrine proceeded rapidly. By late 1944, the Navy had integrated escort carriers into all aspects of naval operations. They served with fleet carrier task forces as replenishment ships, Fing replacement aircraft to combat carriers. They provided anti-submarine screens for battleship groups and cruiser task forces. They accompanied amphibious assault forces, offering close air support that fleet carriers could not provide while remaining far enough offshore to avoid coastal defenses. In the Pacific, escort carriers became essential to the island-hopping campaign. At the Battle of Lee Gulf in October 1944, 6 escort carriers of Taffy III encountered the Japanese center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers closing to attack the invasion beaches. The engagement began at 6:48 hours when lookouts aboard USS Fanshawe Bay spotted pagod masts on the horizon. Within minutes, 18-inch shells from battleship Yamato began falling around the escort carriers. Admiral Clifton Spragg, commanding Taffy III, faced an impossible situation. His 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts were outgunned, outranged, and vastly slower than the approaching Japanese force. The nearest American fleet carriers were over 100 meters away. The invasion beaches, packed with vulnerable transports and landing craft, lay directly behind his formation. If the Japanese broke through, thousands of American soldiers would be slaughtered. Spragg ordered his carriers to launch every aircraft they had, regardless of armament. Torpedo bombers carried depth charges intended for submarine hunting. Fighters were armed with machine guns and small bombs meant for ground support. Some aircraft launched with no weapons at all, making dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. The escort carriers turned east into the wind for flight operations and ran at maximum speed toward a rain squall that might provide temporary concealment. For 1 to 2 hours, the converted merchantmen dodged shells from battleship main batteries while their aircraft attacked the vastly superior Japanese force. Destroyers and destroyer escorts charged the Japanese line, launching torpedoes and firing their 5-in guns at battleships and cruisers. The escorts were annihilated one by one, but their sacrifice bought time. Japanese Admiral Teo Kurita, confused by the ferocity of the defense and convinced by radio intercepts that he faced fleet carriers, broke off his attack and withdrew at 09:25 hours. The cost had been severe. USS Gambia Bay was hit repeatedly by Japanese cruisers. Shells tore through her unarmored hull. She lost power, listed, capsized, and sank with 147 crew members. USS St. Lo survived the surface action only to be hit at 10:51 hours by the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. A Mitsubishi Zero, possibly piloted by Lieutenant Yukioi, crashed through her flight deck and detonated in the hangar among fueled and armed aircraft. Secondary explosions tore the ship apart. She sank 30 minutes later with 1 to 13 killed, yet the remaining 4 escort carriers of Taffy 3 escaped. The Battle of Samar demonstrated both the terrible vulnerability of escort carriers and their unexpected resilience. These ships, designed for submarine hunting and convoy escort, had stood toe-to-toe with battleships and survived. Their sacrifice saved the later invasion force from annihilation. Naval historians would call it the most gallant action in United States Navy history. Post-war analysis revealed the full scope of escort carrier impact. Research conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that escort carriers had been instrumental in defeating the U-boat offensive. Without continuous air coverage in the mid-Atlantic gap, convoy losses would have remained unsustainable. Britain might have been forced to reduce imports below survival levels. The build-up for D-Day, which required transporting millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic, could have been delayed or cancelled. Every division that landed in Normandy had crossed the ocean under the protection of escort carrier groups. German naval records captured after the war showed that Admiral Dönitz had considered the escort carrier threat existential to U-boat operations. In his memoirs, Dönitz wrote that the appearance of American escort carriers in the spring of 1943 had forced a complete reconsideration of submarine tactics. Surfacing became impossible in areas where carrier groups operated. Battery charging had to be done at Proins, a night under constant aircraft threat. Transit times increased dramatically as U-boat crept submerged through carrier patrol areas, burning precious battery power to avoid detection. The psychological toll on U-boat crews was severe. Submarines that had once surfaced freely to run on diesel engines were now confined underwater for days at a time. Crews suffered from carbon dioxide poisoning as air quality deteriorated, battery cells failed from overuse, navigation became guesswork when submarines could not surface to take star sights. Morale collapsed as boats returned from patrols without sinking a single ship. By late 1943, veteran U-boat commanders were requesting transfer to surface ships. New crews required extensive psychological conditioning before their first patrol. Dönitz had pinned his hopes on Type 21 submarines that could outrun aircraft while submerged. These revolutionary boats with streamlined hulls and massive battery banks represented a technological leap forward. They could make 17 knots underwater, faster than most escort ships, and fast enough to outrun depth charges. They could remain submerged for extended periods, eliminating the vulnerability that escort carriers exploited. But these revolutionary boats entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Production delays and bombing of construction yards limited completed hulls to 118 by Warsend. Only 4 Type 21s made operational patrols before Germany surrendered. None encountered American escort carriers in combat. For the crews who served aboard escort carriers, the war was an experience of extreme contrasts. Living conditions were cramped beyond anything fleet carrier sailors knew. The converted merchant ships lacked the amenities designed into purpose-built warships. Ventilation was inadequate in tropical waters and freezing in North Atlantic storms. Berthing spaces were crowded with bunks stacked 3 high. The ships rolled viciously in Atlantic storms, their flat bottoms and high-top sides creating maximum leverage for ocean swells. Sailors joked that escort carriers would roll on wet grass. The flight deck crews worked under conditions that would have been considered impossible on fleet carriers. They serviced aircraft in weather that fleet carriers would have suspended operations. They launched and recovered planes in seas that tossed the small carriers like corks. They armed torpedoes and depth charges while standing on decks pitching 30 degrees. Everything was harder, colder, wetter, and more dangerous than on the big carriers. The pilots faced unique challenges. The short flight decks left no margin for error on landing. An Avenger had to catch one of 8 arresting wires stretched across a 442 FT deck, while landing on a ship that might be rolling 15er. Miss all the wires and crash barriers offered the only chance to avoid 28 are going over the bow into the ocean. Yet Composite Squadron 9 pilots made thousands of landings without losing a single aircraft to enemy action. Yet the men who flew from escort carrier decks developed intense pride in their vessels. They knew their ships were underpowered, underarmed, and underprotected. They called them Kaiser coffins and jeep carriers. They referred to the CVE designation as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But they also knew their ships had changed the course of the war. A pilot from Composite Squadron 9 in interviewed decades later, said simply, "We flew from a merchant ship with a flight deck nailed on top. We sank submarines that were supposed to be sinking us. The brass said we couldn't do it. We did it anyway." The story of escort carriers vindicated not just a type of ship, but a philosophy of industrial warfare. American shipyards had produced these carriers using assembly line techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing. Henry Kaiser had never built a ship before the war. His experience came from constructing dams and highways. He approached shipbuilding as an engineering problem, not a craft tradition. Workers who had never held a welding torch in 1940 were building aircraft carriers by 1943. Prefabricated sections built inland were transported to shipyards and welded together. Women workers, many with no prior shipbuilding experience, operated cranes and welding equipment. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, but reality on Kaiser's assembly lines. Ships that would have required 2 years to build in peacetime using traditional methods were completed in 8 months using modular construction. By war's end, construction times had dropped to 3 and 1/2 months. This approach violated traditional naval architecture principles that emphasized custom construction and meticulous handcraftsmanship. Naval constructors trained at Annapolis and the Naval War College viewed each ship as a unique creation built to exacting specifications by skilled artisans. Kaiser's approach treated ships as manufactured products, stamped out like automobiles with interchangeable parts and standardized procedures. The naval establishment considered this industrial barbarism, yet they proved combat effective. Their weapons worked, their aircraft flew, their crews fought and won. The ships that Navy architects called floating death traps survived combat with battleships. The carriers that Bureau of Aeronautics wanted to cancel sank 53 U-boat. The vessels that admirals dismissed closed the mid-Atlantic gap and won the Battle of the Atlantic. Roosevelt's judgment had been vindicated. The president, with no naval experience, had grasped modern warfare better than admirals with decades of service. The final accounting showed approximately 80 escort carriers commissioned in the United States Navy during World War II. Of these, only 6 were lost to enemy action, a loss rate of 6.7%. This compared favorably to the 13% loss rate for fleet and light carriers. The converted merchantmen had proven as survivable as their larger cousins, despite carrying no armor and mounting minimal defensive armament. Their combat record was equally impressive. Escort carrier groups sank 53 German submarines and over 30 Japanese submarines. They shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft. They supported amphibious landings from North Africa to Okinawa. They fed thousands of replacement aircraft to combat zones. They trained tens of thousands of naval aviators in carrier operations. More than raw statistics, escort carriers changed how naval wars were fought. They demonstrated that numbers could overwhelm quality, that adequate ships in quantity beat superior ships in limited numbers. They proved that industrial capacity was itself a form of military power. They showed that unconventional solutions to tactical problems could succeed when orthodox approaches failed. The admirals who had opposed escort carriers in 1940 never publicly acknowledged their error. But the Navy's post-war planning incorporated escort carriers as essential fleet units. The Commencement Bay-class 40 ships ordered beginning in 1943 were purpose-designed escort carriers built to naval rather than merchant standards. Though only 19 were completed before war's end, these ships showed that the Navy had fully embraced the concept. The transformation from skepticism to acceptance reflected a larger shift in American military thinking during World War II. At the war's beginning, professional military officers distrusted civilian interference in strategic decisions. President Roosevelt's order to build escort carriers over Navy objections represented exactly the kind of political meddling that officers feared. Yet Roosevelt had been vindicated. His strategic foresight had recognized the vital necessity that many senior naval officers had overlooked. When the war concluded in August 1945, the Navy faced the dilemma of what to do with its numerous escort carriers. Most were already outdated before they even launched, constructed to meet urgent wartime demands that peacetime no longer required. 33 were handed over to Allied nations through military assistance programs. Many others were quickly dismantled or placed in long-term reserve fleets. A handful found new life in peacetime as helicopter carriers or training vessels. By 1960, every World War II-era escort carrier had either been retired or transferred abroad. None survived as a museum relic. Their influence, however, endured in less tangible but far more lasting ways. Post-war carrier design absorbed numerous lessons from escort carrier operations. The necessity of continuous air coverage, the strategic flexibility offered by multiple smaller carriers instead of a few massive ones, and the integration of anti-submarine and air superiority roles. All of these had been proven in the crucible of escort carrier combat. Modern naval aviation doctrine could trace its origins directly to the innovations developed aboard these converted merchant ships. The U-boat menace they had once eradicated never returned. Post-war German submarine development shifted toward coastal defense and intelligence missions rather than open-ocean commerce raiding. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union built hundreds of submarines, but none were employed in the same Wolfpack-style campaigns that the escort carriers had annihilated in 1943. Anti-submarine warfare remained vital, but helicopters, long-range patrol planes, and advanced sonar eliminated the need for surface-based submarine hunters. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the escort carriers was their very irrelevance in later wars. They were designed to confront a single, overwhelming crisis, the U-boat threat in the Atlantic, and they succeeded so thoroughly that their mission ceased to exist. No future war demanded the transformation of merchant hulls into improvised aircraft carriers. The escort carriers had fulfilled their duty so completely that nothing like them was ever needed again. In the final assessment, escort carriers embodied American wartime industry at its peak. Simple enough for rapid production, capable enough to deliver results, and available in quantities large enough to overwhelm the enemy. The skeptics who once labeled them death traps in 1940 had judged them by peacetime logic. In war, these converted merchant ships proved brutally effective. From 116 operational U-boats in May 1943 to just 51 by August, the turnaround took less than 3 months. Escort carriers weren't the sole reason for that victory. Long-range patrol aircraft, radar improvements, code breaking, and aggressive destroyer tactics all played crucial roles. But they were the key that closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where submarines had once been invincible. They hunted where land-based planes could not fly. They turned predators into prey. History remembers them as indispensable.